maybe let's move forward to this neutrality question, because this links up now. I had a talk also with Dmitry Trenin, who's a wonderful Russian analyst, and he spent a lot of time in the United States, like a real good friend, right, of the US. But by now he's thoroughly disillusioned. And I asked him, can we write a paper together to try to analyze why neutrality failed for Ukraine? Because I couldn't understand that a year ago. And his answer was, I'm sorry, this is not my place. This is up to the Europeans to figure it out. And now, a year later, I'm at the point where I say, like, yeah, it's because the neocons wouldn't allow that. The people that you described, it's all or nothing, either with us or against us, and we cannot have a neutral Ukraine, although everybody who has a brain in the US, from left to right, from Kissinger to Kissinger said so, what's his name, Noam Chomsky, and said so. I mean, again, Jack Matlock, everybody said this is the typical, the prototypical kind of state to be neutral, just like Austria in 55, exactly that. And this would solve the issue, and it didn't materialize. And by now my answer is because the neocons kept pushing, and they don't accept it. Is that the case or not?
Well, yes, because of course the people that you just mentioned, people like Kissinger, Chomsky, are that earlier generation who were concerned about nuclear annihilation and who were worried in the 1950s and 60s that, you know, the Cold War was in danger of getting completely out of control. And they represent that older version of American foreign policy. Remember, Kissinger played an absolutely instrumental role in negotiating the end of the Cold War. I mean, he may not be everybody's favorite person. He's not mine, by the way. I mean, I remember him. I can remember him when he was Secretary of State and Richard Nixon's national security advisor. I didn't like him then. I don't like him now. But the fact is, in his own way, he was a foreign policy realist. Chomsky was one of the great critics. Now, of the kind of policies that had brought us to that point of nuclear annihilation. And people like Kissinger and Chomsky and others like them, what they understand is that the single most important thing, the priority for political leaders in a world where we have nuclear weapons, is to preserve peace. That was their understanding of what the objective of foreign policy ought to be. Now, the other people, and I'm glad you brought up the word neocons, because I think we can now start to refer to them in that way. I mean, this is an expression that really began to take hold more in the early 2000s, but I think let's call them that from this point on. But the neocons, the priority is not to achieve peace, it is to secure victory. It is a completely different outlook. And if you are seeking peace, then of course, from their interpretation, that is appeasement. And that has disastrous effects. And the disaster that we are seeing in Ukraine today, which was completely avoidable and which would never have happened if people like Kissinger had remained in charge of the foreign policy of the United States. The disaster we're seeing in Ukraine today is precisely because it is the second group, the people who are the victors or who perceive themselves to be the victors of the Cold War, wrongly as it happens. Those people are in overall charge of US foreign policy. And in fact, they're becoming even more angry and belligerent and aggressive as they sense that the Russians won't accept that they lost the Cold War. And as they see this dominant position that the United States had achieved in the 1990s slip away. And that makes them even more forceful in their attempts to secure their victory, the victory that they imagined they achieved.
Now, this is so disillusioning to me, because I thought, this neutrality concept is one that has saved guarded peace several times through history. Switzerland, one of them, Austria, another one. We've got several examples. I mean, even Belgium, it worked for basically 80 years. That's a good amount of time where like a concept keeps a place safe, right? Now we're realizing the attacks on neutrality and non-alignment on basically the part of the world that doesn't want to use warfare is not coming from Russia or from China. It's come from the United States. Now, where does this leave that as like realists in international relations? Can this concept still add something in order to secure peace, or is it doomed? Where do you see it going?
It is absolutely vital if we're going to secure peace. Now, you mentioned Dmitry Trenin, who I also have an enormous respect for. And of course, this is the fundamental difference between Americans and Russians. And it goes back to your earlier point, because, of course, Americans have no experience of war on their territory and of defeat, military defeat. Of course, the Russians do. For them, war is something that they are incredibly familiar with and which they understand very well what the consequences of being defeated can be. And Trenin and people like him expected that in the United States people would understand that. And I think they're baffled and deeply disillusioned and very unhappy and very angry, actually, because they didn't find that understanding in the United States. Now, the Russians, even during the Cold War, after the Second World War was ending, were looking to establish neutral positions in Europe. So, for example, Joseph Stalin, a man, most people would not perhaps have very much good to say for, but his policy after the end of the Second World War was a disarmed and neutral Germany.
Yes.
He wanted that stability in Europe that would both protect Russia's position, which had just been through a devastating war, and at the same time, as he saw it, would work in the interests of all parties. He led the Soviet Union through this terrible war. He didn't want to have the experience of a further one against a much more powerful country. His priority, in his own way, was to secure peace. And it was after he died, the Soviets managed to persuade the Western powers to agree that with Austria. And there was an understanding that, yes, we have by this point divided Europe into a situation where there are camps. But there was also an understanding that this shouldn't be spread right across the world. And you had this extraordinary ballast in the international system during the Cold War, which is the non-aligned movement, which is a kind of neutral movement that emerged from the Bandung Conference in 1955. And it was a major stabilizer and came to be understood more rapidly in the Soviet Union, but eventually even in the United States, that was an essential part of the global architecture. So neutrality absolutely has a place to play. If you prioritize peace, what you understand is that you need neutral states, you need neutrality, both for the benefit of those states and for the benefit ultimately of the great powers. Because if the great powers see one great power absorbing all the former neutral states and bringing them together into its alliance system or sphere of influence, then they will feel threatened, and that will mean that they are no longer secure in themselves, and that will undermine peace, and it will eventually lead to war, which is exactly what we have seen in Ukraine now.
Absolutely. You're absolutely right. The issue that we have is, how do we trust them again? Because as much as I would say any Russian, whoever believes, again, a promise that comes from the West would be ill-advised, because by now we've seen over 30 years, so many broken promises, so many on paper and not. The Russians broke their own promises too. They did so too. But the thing that we need to learn is you cannot trust these promises. So what you need is a system that stabilizes itself without relying too much on these pieces of paper. Do you see a way that through which to do that? I mean, maybe with the logic that you outlined of having neutrals that need to be there in order to secure the others and tell them, like, look, we're not actually expanding, just as NATO now did.
Yes, I mean, this is, you put your finger on what is now by far the single and greatest problem, because one mustn't idealize the Russians, but the big initiatives to end the Cold War started with them, with Gorbachev, yes, with people around him. And I mean, they took the first critically important steps to end the Cold War. And they were given all kinds of assurances and promises, which it is increasingly clear now were never intended seriously. And of course, that is very embittering. And the way in which the Ukraine crisis has developed has been even more embittering for them. I mean, the disclosures, for example, by Merkel and Hollande, very unwise disclosures. I mean, even if that's what they actually did, I think they were unwise to admit to the fact that the Minsk agreement was basically an exercise in stringing the Russians along whilst Ukraine rearmed. I mean, that kind of thing is disastrous. And it has poisoned the international atmosphere to a terrible extent. I'm very sorry to say this. I think that this is something which I would deeply regret, but I think the only way that we're going to get out of this situation now is for us to return to something like the kind of situation that existed in the early 1960s, where after a period of intense confrontation, the great powers had in effect secured their own positions, because that was partly what happened in the early 1960s over the Berlin crisis and the Cuban crisis, and had sort of worked out what the boundaries are, and it made it obvious that they would act decisively to protect those boundaries. And then that gave a reason for pause, and it gave opportunities then to pursue the détente process and to build peace. And it's going to be an enormous and incredibly complex undertaking. And one of the great tragedies is that, of course, Europe, for reasons that I find very difficult to understand, has allowed itself to be swept along by this American narrative of victory in the Cold War, and where it could also have played a key role in establishing this system, this moving us back towards peace. It's very difficult to see the Russians trusting the Europeans either. But there is a greater world. It's a much more complicated, much more diverse world than it was during the Cold War. It's no longer just two superpowers. There are many power centers either in existence today or emerging in the world. And of course, they will have their say. And what they say and do will ultimately have ever greater influence. So China, obviously, India as well, the countries of the Middle East who are beginning to organize themselves, the African states, which have been courted by both sides, the Latin American states that are also being courted by both sides, some of the other important countries in Asia as well.
And except for the United States and NATO, there's no other force in the world that tries to build at the moment alliances. The Russians are not trying to make them. The Chinese are not trying to make them. This whole idea that there's a Russian-Chinese alliance is stupid. If that's an alliance, we just need a new word for what NATO is, because it's completely, utterly different categories, right? And China and Russia are not trying to build alliances. Nobody except for the United States. How do you see that dynamic play out?
Yeah, you're absolutely correct. I mean, the Chinese and the Russians forswear alliances. They say that the whole objection to alliances is that they are always alliances against someone. So if you create an alliance system, you inevitably have to identify an enemy. And they don't want to have enemies because they understand that if you create enemies, if you actually set about establishing enemies, then you are threatening peace. You're undermining peace. They would prefer a system where, in effect, everybody without exception is neutral in relation to everybody else. And it's a difficult concept to understand, perhaps for Westerners who are brought up in a completely different way of thinking. But if you know anything at all about Russian history and Chinese history, and also the histories, by the way, of the various nations of Africa, Latin America, which have had the experience of colonialism, you will understand why they think in that kind of way. So, yes, the United States is the only country that is pushing alliances. And of course, it's been very successful in pushing its idea of an alliance in Europe. It's capitalized, as I said, on this belief that it won the Cold War, which is a false belief, both in the United States, but also with some people in Europe. It's promoted this idea that its conception is the only one, and that everybody has to be either with it or against it on any issue. Like Ukraine, for example, they're very angry with countries like India because India won't agree with the United States about Russia and about Ukraine. And the Americans find that intolerable. So they are unique in this. And at the same time, what they are finding is that countries around the world will not be coerced into taking those sort of positions that the United States wants them to take. And the Americans both find that infuriating, but it's a reality they're going to have to live with. And this reality of states diversifying their foreign policy, seeking peace with each other, increasingly building their own relations with each other, their own trading systems, their own financial systems outside the control of the United States. That is going to intensify and it's going to accelerate, whether the United States wants that to happen or not. And eventually, I am sure that instead of the United States containing its rivals, what will happen is that the United States will find that it itself is being contained.
It clips itself off together with some European countries. Just like the sanctions right now are backfiring and are basically killing the countries that were supposed to protect themselves through that. But last question. History has this. History creates ironies over and over and over. If you look at the fact that in Taiwan, the most pro let's reunite party is the KMT, that's just ironic. Given enough time, ironies emerge. Now, question. George Kennan in the Long Telegram famously wrote back from Moscow to Washington right after the Second World War that the only thing that the Soviets understand is the logic of force. You have to be forceful with them. That's the only thing that will stop this communist ideology from spreading. 80 years later, would you say it's a fair assessment to say that by now it has flipped? It's the Americans who only understand the logic of force, because everything else they will either not adhere to or they will just ignore.
Absolutely. Well, of course, I mean, the point to say about Kennan is that I think he himself came to see with time that he'd overstated the position in the Long Telegram. And he became a major supporter and advocate of détente and of peace, seeking peace with the Soviet Union. And of course, he was a strong opponent and critic of the expansion of NATO. So Kennan gradually came to change his views, a fact which perhaps isn't either fully understood by his critics or indeed some of his supporters who insist that he was consistent all the way along, which he, by the way, wasn't. But yes, I'm afraid you're absolutely right about the United States. At the present moment in time, the United States still has this belief that it won the Second World War, apparently by itself. Other countries were only secondary actors, but this seems to be the major, if you like, mythology that the United States has created about itself, that it won the Cold War itself, and that its mission is to promote its own conception of its values to every single corner of the world, and that it has a right to do that and a duty to do that, and that the only way in which the world can progress is if it follows American leadership. And that is an incredibly dangerous, I would say, to be frank, megalomaniac view of any country's position, that it has some kind of right to guide the whole of humanity in a certain direction. Now, a country that has come to think of itself in that way, the only way other countries can deal with it is by containing it. And eventually, if it is contained successfully, then over time, the dissident voices which do exist in the United States, and which are growing stronger, by the way, will eventually, I think, win the internal argument within the United States itself. Because we haven't talked about the internal realities of the United States. It's important to understand that this reckless foreign policy that the United States is conducting is ultimately ruinous. It's very bad for the United States itself. It is dissipating US resources and US attention. And it means that US leaders, instead of being focused, for example, on what's happening in Pennsylvania or wherever, New Mexico, wherever, are most of the time worrying about what's going to happen at the 𝗧𝗪𝗂𝗂𝗁 gap between Poland and Russia, or what moves are going to be taken, in Indonesia or whatever. They're spending more time worrying about things of that nature as they see the world as some sort of, battleground or chessboard, that they're more consumed with that game than they are with the internal problems, the growing internal problems of the United States, which are, by the way, causing growing political polarization in the United States, as more and more people in America not only question the policy, but demand, sometimes in strident and unhelpful ways, that they be given attention from the political system as well, a political system that they feel is ignoring them.
Alexander Mercouris, I would like to thank you very much for this wonderful analysis, and I hope to talk to you soon again. This was great, a great talk. Thank you.
My great pleasure, Pascal, and let's definitely do this again.